The beast, the outpost, floated in the dark silence of space, like a lonely island in an endless sea, and inside its steel walls lived many species from across the stars, each one carrying their own pride and fear and grudges. The place was alive with voices of traders, engineers, soldiers, and wanderers. But among all these people, there was one figure who made every hall grow quiet whenever she entered. They called her a beast, not in whispers, but openly, with fear and scorn in their voices. She was tall enough to tower above most alien soldiers, her shoulders broad, her arms scarred, and her face marked by the history of battles that had shaped her life. Her skin was rougher than others, and her eyes burned with a sharp light that made even seasoned warriors turn away. She had fought wars long before most of the young recruits in the outpost had even left their home planets, and for this reason, the commanders respected her. Yet respect was mixed with fear, and fear was twisted into cruelty, and so they never called her by her true name, only Beast. When she walked through the market ring, the crowd would step aside. The vendors who shouted prices for fruit or metal parts would lower their voices and look away. Small children of other species would cling to their parents when they saw her coming. Soldiers would nudge each other and laugh, calling her a creature without a heart, saying she was nothing but a weapon given shape. The words pierced her, but she never showed pain. She had long learned that showing pain would only feed their mockery. The truth was, she did not ask for the scars across her arms or the battles that shaped her body. She did not choose to become the outpost guardian. She had been taken from her people long ago, trained in war, forced to fight for others, while her own wishes were buried deep under armor and discipline. She carried herself like stone, because stone could not be broken. But deep inside the stone, there was a silence she could not escape, a silence that spoke of loneliness. One cycle, the outpost received new arrivals. A transport ship brought supplies, and along with them came a group of human recruits. Humans were still new to the great network of civilizations. They were smaller compared to many alien races, yet their curiosity and stubborn courage often surprised the galaxy. Among the group was one human who noticed the stares of others as they entered the docking bay. He saw how every head turned when she stepped into view, towering above the crowd like a shadow over the stars. Most of the recruits whispered just like the others. Their voices carried the same fear, calling her dangerous, ugly beast monster. But the human did not join in. He watched her walk past with her heavy steps that echoed on the floor. His eyes did not hold mockery nor fear. They held something else. He looked as though he wanted to understand what the others could not. Days passed, and the outpost continued its rhythm. The beast, as they called her, moved from duty to duty, patrolling the long corridors, guarding the gates, standing watch during trade exchanges. She kept to herself, never speaking unless spoken to, because words usually ended in mockery. Then one evening in the mess hall, she entered as usual, carrying her tray of food. The hall grew quieter as always. A group of soldiers from another species began their laughter, whispering loud enough for her to hear, calling her half creature, half machine, saying she had no place among them. She ignored them. She always ignored them and sat alone at the far end of the hall. But this time something different happened. The human recruit, who had been watching her for days, stood up from his table, and instead of following his companions, he walked toward her. He carried his tray, and without hesitation sat across from her. The hall grew still. Every eye turned to watch. No one ever sat with the beast. Even those who dared to talk to her did so only when ordered. But here was a young human with no command, no reason, sitting in front of her as if she were anyone else. She stared at him, expecting the usual mockery or perhaps fear, but his expression was calm. He took a bite of his food and then looked at her again. He said nothing for a long moment, simply sharing the silence. She waited, but he did not insult her, did not flinch under her gaze. Finally she asked him in her deep voice why he sat there. He answered simply, because you look lonely. The words struck her more sharply than any weapon. She had been called monster, beast, weapon, scar bearer, but never had someone spoken to her as If she were just a person who could feel loneliness, she felt a weight in her chest that she did not recognize, a feeling she thought had died long ago. He did not look away from her scars. He did not laugh at her silence. He only treated her as if she mattered around them. Whispers rose. Soldiers laughed, shaking their heads, calling the human foolish, daring, saying he would regret it. Yet he did not move. He finished his food calmly, and when he left he nodded to her, as if they had shared something normal, something simple. For the first time in many cycles, she felt the silence within her shift. It was as though a crack had formed in the stone around her. A single human had looked at her, not as a beast, but as someone worth sitting with, worth speaking to. She could not understand why, but deep inside she wanted to know more. She wanted to hear his voice again, to feel that strange warmth that came from being treated as more than a weapon. That night when she returned to her quarters, she stared at the scars on her arms. She had seen them countless times before, and each time they reminded her of the battles that had taken everything from her. But now for the first time she wondered if perhaps there was something beyond the scars, something more than what the galaxy had chosen to see. And in that small thought, in that quiet crack within the stone, the King Guzon story of the beast began to change the meeting. Outpost was never truly quiet. There was always the hum of machines, the heavy thrum of reactors deep in the station's core, and the constant movement of ships docking and leaving with cargo and passengers. Soldiers patrolled the halls, traders shouted at markets, engineers argued over repairs. But beneath all this noise there was also another rhythm, the rhythm of glances and whispers whenever she walked by. It was the same rhythm she had lived with for years, a song of fear and disdain, and she had grown used to it, like one grows used to the cold of a long winter. Yet now there was something that unsettled her. A single human had sat with her in the mess hall. He had spoken only a few words, but they had cut deeper than the cruel laughter of others, because those words had not been cruel. They had been gentle. She carried them with her as she walked her rounds, wondering why such simple words would not leave her mind. The human recruit was given work in the engineering sector of the outpost. His hands were smaller than most other workers, and he did not have the strength of larger species, but he carried patience and focus in his tasks. He asked questions, listened carefully, and treated every machine as if it were alive. The others laughed at him, sometimes saying he worked too slow or cared too much, but he never changed his way. Their paths crossed again, sooner than she expected. She was assigned to guard the storage bay where the human and his team were repairing damaged loading machines. She entered the bay, and the workers stiffened, as always, pretending not to look at her, while whispering behind her back. The human, however, raised his head when she entered. His gaze met hers openly, without hesitation, as though he had been waiting for her. She stood near the gate, watching silently while he worked. She told herself she was only doing her duty, but her eyes followed him more than they followed the bay. He struggled to lift a heavy panel, and before anyone else moved, she crossed the floor and lifted it, with one hand placing it gently where he needed it. He looked at her and smiled softly, thanking her in the same calm voice as before. No mockery, no fear, only gratitude. The other workers exchanged nervous glances, whispering that she must be trying to intimidate him. Some even warned him to be careful, but he ignored them and continued to speak with her when she passed by. He asked her if she had seen battles beyond the outpost. He asked her how long she had lived among these stars. He asked as if he wanted to know her story, and not the story others told about her. She gave short answers at first, her voice low, unused to conversation. But slowly she began to share small pieces, fragments of a life hidden under scars. One day during a repair shift, the power flickered across the sector, plunging the bay into shadows. The workers cursed as they scrambled to restore systems. She stood, unmoving, her eyes adjusting to the dark, watching for threats that could slip through such chaos. The human, however, moved closer to her, as though her presence gave him safety. He said quietly that the dark reminded him of nights on his home world, When he would watch the stars through broken rooftops, she listened silently, but inside her chest a strange warmth stirred. No one had ever spoken so simply to her, as if she too might understand the beauty of stars, when the lights returned the other. Workers noticed him standing near her, and laughter broke out. They called him foolish, saying he was wasting his time speaking to a beast. They said he was trying to tame something that could never be tamed. The words rolled across the bay, but he did not flinch. Instead, he looked at them and said clearly, "She is not a beast. She is a soldier stronger than all of us, and more honorable than any of you." The bay fell silent at his words. For her, the moment felt heavier than any battle she had fought. The title she had been given her whole life, beast, monster weapon, had been shattered by a single human voice that refused to accept them. She felt her throat tighten, but no words came. She turned away before anyone could see the storm within her, yet those words echoed in her mind long after the shift ended. That evening she found herself walking to the observation deck of the outpost, a place she rarely visited, the wide glass walls showed the galaxy in its endless spread of stars and drifting nebulae. She stood there alone until she heard the soft steps of the human he joined her without, asking if she wished for company, standing beside her as though it was the most natural thing. He pointed to the stars, telling her the names humans had given them, describing how each one carried stories from his people. He spoke with quiet wonder, and for the first time she listened to a story, not about war, not about blood, but about beauty and hope. She asked him why he spoke to her when everyone else kept their distance. He looked at her scars, then back at the stars, and said, "Because I do not see what they see. I see someone carrying weight no one else understands. Someone who deserves more than fear." She turned her gaze away, unable to hold his eyes because his words were too much for the stone she had built around her heart. From that day, their paths intertwined more often, sometimes by duty, sometimes by choice. Whenever she stood guard, he would greet her without hesitation. Whenever he worked repairs, she would find ways to assist, even in silence. Sometimes they spoke of small things, food, weather, old battles. Other times they shared silence, yet even the silence between them was different. It no longer felt empty, it felt alive. But the others did not stop mocking. They called him weak for seeking friendship with her. They told him he would regret it, that she would turn on him like a wild creature. He ignored them every time, but she heard the words, and each one cut her deeper, not because she believed them, but because she feared they might drive him away. Yet he never left. His presence remained steady, like the quiet hum of the station always. They're always unshaken one. Night, as alarms rang across the outpost, warning of approaching raiders, she stood ready for battle. The human was nearby, his eyes steady, his hands gripping his tools turned weapons. She felt the old fire rise within her. The call to fight, the role she had always been forced to play. But this time something was different. When she looked at him, she realized she did not want to be seen as a beast in battle. She wanted to be seen as more. She wanted him to see her not for the fury of her strength, but for the truth within her heart. And in that moment, she understood that everything was beginning to change. The attack warning faded after a few tense hours. The raiders never reached the outpost, and life returned to its usual rhythm, but something inside her had already shifted. She could not shake the image of the human standing steady during the alarm. His small frame calm, his eyes clear, while others panicked. She had fought countless battles with warriors who carried larger weapons, stronger armor, fiercer reputations. Yet none of them had shown the same quiet strength she had seen in him. That strength was not in his body, but in the way he looked at her, without fear, without mockery, as if she were more than. The scars that covered her days turned into weeks, and the bond between them grew, though few others dared to notice it openly. He continued to greet her in the mess hall, sitting beside her as if it were the most natural thing. He brought simple stories of his home world, stories of rivers that glowed under the night sky, of mountains that cut into the clouds, of children who played freely without war. She listened in silence, at first unsure how to answer, but slowly she began to share fragments of her own past, She told him of her people who had been proud and strong until war broke them. She told him how she was taken young, trained to fight, and shaped into a weapon. She did not tell such things to seek pity. She spoke because, for the first time, someone actually wished to hear her truth. The human did not look away when she spoke of blood and fire. He did not try to comfort her with empty words. He only listened, his eyes steady, as if he could carry some of the weight she bore. That simple act of listening began to soften the stone she had built around her heart. She found herself speaking more each day. She told him how she enjoyed the quiet hum of engines, the rare time she could sit without orders, the stars that looked like rivers of light outside the observation deck. He smiled at these details, not because they were grand, but because they revealed who she truly was. Others still mocked. The sight of a human walking beside her through the corridors became a subject of laughter. Soldiers joked that he was trying to tame a monster. Traitors warned him that one day she would crush him with her temper. But the human never faltered. His calm voice always cut through their noise. He would answer that she was not a monster but a warrior. He would tell them she had honor they could never understand. His words did not silence their laughter, but they began to carve deeper cracks in the walls around her. Spirit, one evening, after a long shift, she found him in the repair bay working alone. The machines around him hissed and sparked while he knelt with grease on his hands. She approached quietly, and for a moment only watched him. The way he focused, the way he hummed softly to himself, the way his small hands moved with care. She asked why he worked alone, and he replied that the others had gone to rest, but the machine still needed him. She offered her help, and for the first time she did not feel like a guard or a weapon. She felt like a partner. They worked side by side until the machine came alive again. Its lights glowed, its gears turned, and the human grinned, wiping his brow. She felt a rare smile form on her own lips, small, uncertain, but real. He noticed it, and said softly, "That suits you better than the scars." She turned away quickly, her heart beating harder than in any battle. She had faced armies without fear, yet a simple smile from him had undone her armor. After that night, they spent more time together. Sometimes they sat on the observation deck saying little while the stars stretched endless before them. Sometimes he shared food from his world, letting her taste fruits she had never known. Sometimes she taught him how to hold a blade, how to stand firm, how to strike true though he was clumsy, and laughed at his own mistakes. Each shared moment became another thread, binding them closer together. She began to wait for his presence in ways she could not admit to herself. She listened for his steps. She searched for his voice. She guarded him even when there was no danger, but with closeness came fear. Fear that the bond would be torn away. Fear that the others would find ways to use it against them. She had seen the cruelty of the galaxy too many times. She knew how easily something precious could be destroyed. She tried to push those thoughts away, yet they lingered in her chest like heavy chains. One night, she spoke the fear aloud. She told him that those around them would never understand, that they would always see her as beast and him as fool. She told him it would be easier for him to walk away before the weight crushed him. He listened quietly, then shook his head and said, "I see beauty where others refuse to look. You cannot change what they see, but you cannot change what I see either." She felt her throat close at his words, unable to speak, because no one had ever called her beautiful, not even in kindness, let alone truth. The bond grew stronger still, but the world around them did not soften. The commanders noticed his closeness to her and warned him sternly. They told him she was a weapon, not a friend. They reminded him that weapons were meant to be used, not cherished. He listened, but did not obey their warnings, only hardened his resolve. Others whispered louder, mocking both of them, yet their laughter mattered less each day, because she no longer stood alone. Human began to see sides of her that no one else cared to notice. He saw how she fixed broken tools gently with hands that could crush metal. He saw how she moved quietly so as not to disturb sleeping workers during night patrols. He saw how she paused in front of the outpost, gardened longer than anyone else, staring at the flowers without touching them, as if afraid she might break them. He saw all these things, and with every detail his respect for her grew, and she began to see herself differently through his eyes. For the first time she wondered if she could be more than the scars, more than the strength, more than the weapon they had forced her to become. Perhaps she could be something closer to what he saw. Perhaps she could be more than beast. Bond that formed between them was quiet, unseen by most, yet it was powerful because it gave her something she had never dared to hope for before. It gave her the smallest glimpse of what it meant to be accepted. And in the quiet of that bond, a dangerous truth began to grow. She no longer wished only to survive. She wished to be seen as she truly was, and though neither of them knew it yet, that bond would soon be tested in a trial far greater than whispers or laughter. A storm was approaching, one that would show the galaxy the strength not of a beast but of the bond between two souls. The trial the galaxy often forgot peace, because beyond every quiet stretch of stars, there was always a shadow waiting to strike, and one night that shadow fell upon the outpost. It began with alarms echoing through the steel halls, a low trembling sound that shook the walls and made every heart race. Voices rose in panic, ships scrambled to launch defenses, and commanders barked orders across every channel. A fleet of raiders had appeared at the edge of the sector, ruthless scavengers who lived only to burn and take what others had built. The outpost had been attacked before, but never with such force. The raiders were many, their ships armed with weapons that could tear through steel, and their soldiers eager for blood. The defenders rushed to their stations, and among them she stood ready. Her towering figure moved through the halls with steady steps, her scars glowing faintly under the red lights of the alarm. She had fought countless battles before, but this one felt different, because this time the human was here beside her. He was not a soldier in the same way she was. He carried no heavy weapon, no armor forged for war, yet when the alarms rang, he did not hide. Instead, he ran with her to the gates where the first line of defense would be held. He carried only a tool turned into a weapon, but his eyes burned with the same fire she carried. She wanted to tell him to stay back, to remain safe, but she saw the resolve in his gaze, and she knew words would not stop him. The raiders breached the outer hull and poured inside. The corridors filled with smoke, fire, and screams as defenders clashed with the invaders. She fought with the fury that had earned her the name Beast, tearing through the enemy ranks with unmatched strength. Her strikes shook the ground, her roars echoed against the walls, and raiders fell before her like leaves in a storm. Yet through the chaos, her eyes always searched for him. She saw him holding his ground, striking when he could, protecting the wounded, dragging fallen defenders out of danger. He was small compared to the towering enemies, but he moved with courage that made even giants pause. The battle grew heavier. The raiders pushed deeper, forcing the defenders back. Step by step, flames licked the ceilings, sparks rained from shattered panels, and the outpost shook under the weight of the assault. She knew this was the kind of battle where heroes died, where names were carved in fire and ash. She felt the old rage rise within her, the fury that made others call her beast. But this time there was something else driving her forward. She was not fighting only for survival or for the outpost. She was fighting because she could not let the one human who had seen her true self fall to the shadows. At one point in the chaos, she saw him cornered. A group of raiders, larger and armed with blades, rushed him while he tried to shield a wounded worker. Without hesitation, she broke through the enemy lines and placed herself between him and death. Her massive frame blocked the blades, her arms caught the strikes, and with a roar, she threw the raiders aside. She lifted him to his feet, and for a moment, their eyes met in the heart of battle. He did not speak, but his gaze said everything: gratitude, trust, and something deeper. They fought side by side after that. She struck with her unmatched power, and he moved with quick determination, covering her blind spots, helping her rise when the weight of enemies pressed too heavily. Against all odds, they became a pair, a rhythm of strength and courage that surprised even the seasoned warriors watching. The others who once mocked began to follow their lead, rallying behind the strange bond between beast and human. But the raiders were relentless. They unleashed heavy war machines that tore through defenses. The ground shook as a massive armored brute stormed through the gates. Carrying a weapon larger than the human himself, the defenders fell back, fear in their eyes, but she did not move. She planted her feet, her scars burning with the memory of countless battles. She had faced monsters before, and she would face this one too. The human stood at her side, refusing to retreat. Together they charged. The clash was like thunder. She met the brute head on, her strength straining against its weight. While sparks flew from every strike, the human moved swiftly, darting around the giant, cutting at weak points, distracting it so she could land her blows. They were outmatched in size, but together they fought as one. Each time she faltered, he gave her space to rise. Each time he stumbled, she shielded him with her body. The others watched in awe as the so-called beast and the fragile human became the heart of the defense. The battle raged until at last the brute fell with a crash, shaking the floor. Its armored shell shattered, its weapon broken. The defenders cheered, their voices rising above the smoke and fire. But the fight had cost them. The human lay wounded, his side cut by a blade in the final struggle. She knelt beside him, her massive hands trembling as she lifted him gently. He smiled weakly, telling her he was fine, telling her that he had never seen anyone fight with such beauty. She stared at him, stunned by the word beauty echoing in the midst of blood and ash. She carried him to safety, her steps heavy with fear for his life. Around them the raiders began to retreat, beaten back by the defenders who had been inspired by the unlikely pair. The alarms slowly faded, the fires were put out, and the halls filled with the weary silence of survival. The battle was over, but the memory of it would never leave them. For in that trial the galaxy had witnessed not a beast and a fool, but two souls standing together against the storm. When the human awoke in the infirmary, she was there watching over him. He looked at her scars, at her weary eyes, and whispered again, "You are beautiful." She did not know how to answer, because no one had ever spoken those words to her. But deep inside the stone around her heart, something finally broke, and she felt warmth spread where cold had lived for so long. The trial had changed everything, not only for her, but for all who had seen her fight, not as a monster, not as a weapon, but as a protector, as someone capable of love and loyalty. And though whispers would always remain, though some would never let go of the name beast, she no longer carried it alone, because one human had seen her true beauty, and in the fire of battle, the galaxy had seen it too. The beauty, the outpost slowly returned to life after the storm of battle. Repairs filled the days as engineers worked on broken walls, burned decks, and shattered systems. Smell of smoke still lingered in the air, but there was also a quiet pride among the survivors. They had fought against impossible odds and had stood their ground. Many spoke of bravery and sacrifice, but when they spoke of the turning point of the battle, they did not speak of weapons or commanders. They spoke of her and of the human who fought at her side. She walked the halls again, as she always had, but the silence that once followed her was different. Before, people had stepped aside out of fear, whispering beast behind her back. Now their eyes held something else. Soldiers nodded with respect. Traders offered small words of thanks. Children no longer cried when they saw her. Instead, they pointed and whispered stories of how she had broken the raider brute and carried the wounded to safety. It felt strange to her to walk the same halls, yet feel the weight of her presence. Change, but none of that mattered as much as the quiet room in the infirmary where the human still lay healing. His wound was deep, though not deadly, and the medic said time would mend him. She visited each day, sitting silently at his side, sometimes speaking, sometimes saying nothing. Sometimes he would sleep, and she would simply watch the rise and fall of his chest, feeling a strange peace in knowing he still breathed. She had fought 100 wars and carried 1,000 scars, but never had she feared losing someone as much as she feared losing him. When he was awake, they spoke softly. He would tell Her stories of his world of rivers and skies of warmth and laughter. She would tell him small things about herself, not about battles, but about quiet memories she had buried long ago. She told him how as a child she had once held a flower and wondered how something so fragile could survive in a harsh world. She told him how she used to sing when no one listened, though she had not sung in years. He smiled at these pieces of her, as though each one was treasure, and she felt the stone around her heart crumble more each day. As his strength returned, they began walking together again through the outpost. He leaned on her arm at first, though he joked that he slowed her down. She answered in her deep, steady voice that she did not mind soon. He was strong enough to move alone, but he stayed by her side anyway, and she found that she wished for his presence more than anything else. Others still whispered, but now the whispers carried wonder, not mockery. They said the beast had found a companion. They said the human had tamed a monster, but those who had seen the battle knew better. They knew no taming had been done. They had fought as equals, not master and servant, not weapon and wielder. They had fought as two souls bound together. And that truth spread slowly through the outpost, changing how others looked at her one evening. They returned to the observation deck where the stars stretched endless and bright. She stood quietly watching the river of light while he leaned on the rail beside her. He told her again what he had told her in the fire of battle, that she was beautiful. She turned to him, her scars catching the glow of distant suns, and asked softly why he used such a word when others saw only horror. He looked at her long and steady, then said, "Because beauty is not the absence of scars. Beauty is the truth of what you are. And you are stronger and kinder and braver than anyone I have known." She had heard praise before, but it had always been for her strength, for her victories, for her use as a weapon. No one had ever praised her for simply being who she was. The word beauty felt heavy yet gentle, filling the empty spaces inside her with warmth. She did not answer right away, because her throat tightened. But at last she whispered that no one had ever spoken to her that way. He smiled and said, "Then they were blind in that moment. Something changed within her. She had lived her whole life as beast, as monster, as weapon. She had carried the name like a chain, never expecting to be free. Yet here was a human who had seen her scars and called them beautiful, who had seen her silence and called it strength, who had looked at her not as a creature to be feared, but as a soul to be cherished, and because of that she no longer felt like a beast. The outpost moved forward. Weeks turned into months. The scars of battle healed both on the walls and in the hearts of those who lived there. And as life resumed, so too did the bond between them grow. He walked beside her in the markets, no longer alone. She sat with him in the mess hall, no longer isolated. They shared stories, meals, silences, and laughter that no one else had ever heard from her. She still stood as guardian, still bore the title of warrior, but she no longer carried it in solitude. One day, a group of new recruits arrived, young and wide-eyed, just as he once had. They whispered when they saw her towering figure, her scars, her heavy steps. She heard the word beast slip from their lips as it always had. But before she could turn away, the human stepped forward and told them firmly, "You see only with fear. Open your eyes and you will see more. She is not a beast. She is beautiful." They stared at him, confused, uncertain. But something in his voice carried weight, and the word spread again through the halls, a new story to replace the old. She knew there would always be those who mocked, always those who feared. Her scars would never fade. Her sighs would always set her apart. But now she no longer feared the name beast, because it no longer held power over her. It was only a shadow compared to the light she carried within. She had been given something stronger than fear. She had been given a truth that could not be taken, that one human had seen her beauty, and because of that she could finally see it too. On the last evening before his shift took him away to another sector, they stood together once more at the observation deck. The stars stretched endless and silent. She looked at them and then at him, her voice deep but steady as she said, "You gave me back my name. You gave me back myself." He shook his head and replied, I only showed you what was always there. They stood in silence watching the galaxy shimmer, and in that silence she felt whole. For the first time in her life she was not weapon, not beast, not monster. She was simply herself, and in the reflection of his eyes, she was beautiful. And so the story that began with whispers of fear ended with a truth stronger than any blade, a truth carried by a human who saw what no one else would, and by a warrior who found freedom not in battle, but in the simple power of being seen. For in the vast cold universe where shadows lurked beyond every star, it was not strength alone that endured. It was the bond between souls and the courage to see beauty where others saw none. The end.